A while back, Balkan Odyssey and I were brainstorming the video we wanted to collaborate together in making. Before we eventually decided on each making our own videos, both of which we're highly proud of and recommend checking out, one of the ideas we played with for a while was a video called People Liked Socialism, actually. The wording that Balkan Odyssey came up specifically with was interesting to me. Socialism is a popularity game just like any political idea is about popularity. You're never going to get more than 30% of the population to be hardcore socialist ideologues, after all. A lot of people are just naturally apolitical, so what ultimately matters is that people like their government. Of course, that's where we come to the problem of understanding personal experience under socialism. Now, I already made a video a while back about personal experience and socialism, but of all the videos I've made that needs to be made again, it's that one. Not because I don't like it, but because it's still an all-pervasive myth. The idea that people under self-identified socialist states all suffered other than for a small bureaucratic elite. One of the things I can't stand more than anything else is the argument that they at some point lived in the country they're talking about, so they therefore know what they're talking about. People constantly weaponize their place of birth as proof that they're experts on their place of birth, when that's not what being an expert is. Is a far-right Trump sycophant an expert on America because they were born in America? Am I an authority to speak on America just because I live there? Or would I have that authority by actually studying America's history from a class-based, historical materialist perspective? It's like saying, I know how the human digestive system works because I'm a human. You don't actually. You know that food goes in and waste comes out, but you don't know much more than that, besides what actual experts on the digestive system who have studied it tell you. Even if your relative friend genuinely suffered or was persecuted under socialism in ways they didn't deserve, that isn't a condemnation of the system as a whole. People suffer under capitalism constantly, endlessly, at numbers and at rates that dwarf any suffering socialism has caused. Of course, when it comes to capitalism, it's somehow always the fault of the person who failed, rather than the fault of the system. It's just such a right-wing argument that even many supposed leftists fall for easily. Sorry, but just because you have some Baltic friend who has alluded to their innocent grandpa, and of course the grandpa always just so happens to have been completely innocent by their telling of things, suffering under the Soviets doesn't mean shit. People are incredibly gullible when it comes to their own friends or relatives, and just instantly believing whatever they're told, as if anyone you personally associate with or are related to is somehow infallible and couldn't possibly ever tell a lie or be misled. It's just crocodile tears, and no one should have sympathy for the people that constantly pull the socialism sucks because the socialists were mean to me card, because whether they really did suffer or whether all they're complaining about was the fact they couldn't say how much they hated socialists, or they weren't allowed to pogrom Jews, or even just the fact that they couldn't buy 30 different brands of cheeseburger, it's not an actual indictment of socialism as a system no matter how much they try to make it be, especially when so many people actually did like socialism. Of course, you may ask, if many people actually liked living under state socialism, where are they? Well, the answer is that they are everywhere if you look a little. The problem is that people don't look hard enough, if at all, and so therefore they assume there's nothing to look for. There are 3 primary barriers to hearing the voices of those that liked socialism. Firstly, the language barrier. People that move to other countries are more likely to learn the language of the country they move to, so they already have a louder voice. People that are dissidents are usually more likely to be English speakers as compared to pro-socialist country people who don't want to move away and therefore don't need to learn another language in a capitalist country. Similarly, there is the geographical barrier. People who are not dissidents and continue to live happily in a nominally socialist country are not likely to be around to tell people how they like socialism, even if they do speak English. It's not easy to meet or get to know people like that, even if you know their language if you live on the other side of the globe. Actual dissidents are going to be in closer proximity to meet, since they literally moved out of the country they're dissenting from. Finally, however, the third and by far the most important factor is the media barrier. The media naturally censors anyone that will make their system look less preferable. Meanwhile, the people who disliked things under socialism get elevated, get fancy speaking engagements and fellowships. It's lucrative to become a dissident. Just look at the leaders of the Tiananmen Square protests. Many of them that left China all got comfy careers in Silicon Valley or Wall Street. Same with defectors like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Milovan Dailas, and Yomi Park. Some people treat it like it's some conspiracy that capitalist media would elevate and promote the voices of people that make socialism look bad. Why the hell would the capitalist West ever boost the opinions of the countless millions who clearly did have better lives under socialism? This doesn't just happen in Western media, but in countries that were formerly socialist. There's a big cultural stigma in Eastern European countries to admit, openly, that you were happy under the Soviet Union. They were the big evil oppressors. They were the colonizers. So, talking about the free healthcare and housing and education that people were colonized into having is kind of verboten, since it goes against the narrative of colonization and victimhood that forms an extremely core and pivotal part of Eastern European identity politics, and which is also crucial to keeping the right wing in power for as long as possible. As long as all the focus is on an endless culture of victimhood about the horrors of leftism, people don't see how little the current governments in these countries do anything but engage in culture war nonsense. William Blum, author of books that famously pointed out the countless horrific war crimes and coups the US had participated in or caused, famously called himself a Western Bloc dissident, and I think this is a very prescient statement. We don't think of people who disliked or were persecuted by the West as dissidents like we do people who disliked or were persecuted by the East. People like that in the West are just called radicals, criminals, terrorist sympathizers, or just communists, and so on. Imagine if a person came from America. They told you what a horrible place America was, that the healthcare was insane. They couldn't afford to have a kid. They couldn't afford to buy a house. They couldn't find a good paying job. They had to take out loans to get their college degree. Their friend got shot dead by a cop during a mental health crisis. Another friend had an opioid addiction. That's what the dissidents are. That is, when they're not outright lying.
And sometimes people have to push the train.
They have to push the train.
Yeah. Traveling in North Korea.
Still, the actual average socialist citizen and their opinions are everywhere, if you actually look for more than 5 seconds. Quora, for example, is an absolute treasure trove of people talking about their lives in the USSR in positive ways. Yes, there are people who speak badly about the USSR, but they don't seem to be the majority. Also, they often criticize modern Russia in comparison, so these people praising the USSR aren't just Russia sycophants. These are just real people talking about their real lives. The YouTube comment sections under videos of day-to-day life in the USSR are also a huge treasure trove of personal experiences. Before people just say, oh, these are just a bunch of made-up bots. Firstly, it's very funny to think that people would be making bots to lie about countries that are gone. And secondly, there's plenty of video evidence of people saying how things were much better under socialism, and being able to specifically point to the concrete reasons why. Or what about the work of trained historians? Sheila Fitzpatrick's work talks about the huge amount of class mobility in the Soviet Union. Those people definitely liked socialism. Simply by virtue of the massive increase in standards of living and literacy, we know people were happy with these so-called socialist states, or at the very least what socialism brought them. And no one liked their lives in places like the Soviet Union more than women. The sheer extent to which women were emancipated compared to their lives beforehand was extreme and unprecedented, in ways that still have reverberations to this day. Women all the way back in 1917, like Nadyzhda Krupskaya, enjoyed unprecedented power to extents only queens did anywhere else in the world. Perhaps unsurprisingly, almost all of the major Soviet defectors were men. Yes, not every one of them might have liked socialism directly, but especially women, sure liked their better lives. I know that people liked the healthcare, housing, and guaranteed employment that came with socialism that did not exist before it in Russia or anywhere else on earth. They didn't like things like the lack of consumer goods or freedom of artistic expression. Yet despite these flaws, this did not dissuade people from wanting the Soviet Union to continue by over a supermajority of the overall population, and this despite the fact that idiots like Gorbachev were doing everything possible to promote and platform right-wing news outlets in the name of free speech. A bevy of polls have come out since showing that the Soviet Union is missed. And no, not just by Russians either. This is excused as saying these are boomers, nostalgic for the good old days. But people didn't want the Soviet Union to dissolve while it was still around. 72% of all citizens of countries that didn't break away already originally voted for its preservation. These days, it's more often the youth that are the anti-communists. Youth are voting for the AfD in Germany. They voted for Milei in Argentina and Bolsonaro in Brazil. They see the state of the world and how bad it is under neoliberalism, but they've been so brainwashed into being anti-communist that they choose to go right-wing instead. More recently, the polls for who likes the USSR have gone down because the media is endlessly comparing Putin's Russia to the Soviet Union, despite the many times Putin has made clear he's not a big fan of the Soviet Union. That being said, millions of people who did enjoy or are enjoying state socialism are continually ignored and deprived of their voices, and it is therefore our responsibility to do everything we can to elevate these voices as much as possible, and to therefore show that people did, and still do, like to live in socialism. But my sister's mom's uncle's brother, dad's grandpa, who was 7 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed, said the Soviet Union was bad?
Расцветали яблони и груши, поплыли туманы над рекой.